What most women call a loss of motivation after spiritual awakening is actually the soul refusing to return to a life that is no longer aligned. Or pause for a moment and consider that it's not laziness, not depression, not failure. It is the wisdom of your inner being refusing to run on adrenaline, people pleasing, or fear. What has changed is not your capability. What has changed is your willingness to keep sacrificing your truth for false promises of happiness. And so, when the goals of the old self dissolve and the noise fades away, there is silence. And in that silence, there is discomfort, but also clarity. This talk is not about fixing your motivation. It is about redefining it, not through force, but through awareness. Not by looking outward, but by returning inward. Not by achieving more, but by understanding who you have become. What happens to a woman when she awakens and suddenly feels as though her life has lost all direction? One day, she may be filled with clarity, deeply connected to something higher. But soon after, she finds herself sitting in silence, unable to do the things she once did with ease. Her routines seem pointless. Her passions faded. The people around her no longer resonate with her heart, and the goals that once fueled her ambition now feel strangely irrelevant. What she is experiencing is not failure, it is transformation. There's a truth that rarely gets spoken aloud. As the awakening breaks you before it builds you. When a woman begins to see through the illusions of her past, who she thought she needed to be, how she thought she needed to perform, she enters a space of deep spiritual transition. This space can feel like apathy, like demotivation. But underneath it all, something profound is happening. The old self is dissolving. It's essential to understand that spiritual awakening is not a destination. It is a doorway. And walking through that doorway means leaving behind the identity you spent years, sometimes decades, constructing. The woman who once chased perfection in her relationships, who sought validation through appearance, achievements, or being needed, she begins to see clearly that none of these things ever brought her true peace. And so, they lose their grip on her. But here's where the confusion begins. When the motivations that once pushed her forward vanish, she feels lost. She wakes up and finds she no longer wants to pursue what used to define her. She's no longer obsessed with proving her worth. She no longer needs the approval of that man, that friend, or even society itself. Yet in the absence of those external drivers, she hasn't yet discovered the new ones. That in-between place is where most women silently suffer. They wonder, what's wrong with me? When, in truth, what's wrong is simply that they haven't been taught that this space, the void after awakening, is sacred. It is not the absence of motivation. It is the space where authentic motivation is being reborn. It's much like a caterpillar's transformation. Most people celebrate the butterfly, but forget the importance of the cocoon. Inside the cocoon, there is no beauty. There is no movement. There is no recognition. But without it, the butterfly cannot exist. In that dark and motionless space, a complete cellular breakdown happens. The identity of the caterpillar dies, and only through that death can something new emerge. So, when a woman loses motivation after awakening, it's not that she has become less. It is that she has begun to meet her true self for the very first time. It is uncomfortable because the ego is no longer steering the ship. The need to impress, to please, to prove, it's been dethroned. And what remains is stillness. That stillness for many women is unbearable at first, especially if they have lived a life of constant doing, especially if they've been the emotional caregivers in every room they've entered, especially if their worth has always been tied to their productivity. But the stillness isn't emptiness. It's sacred space. It's the womb of the next chapter of your life. A woman once shared this story. She had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder, earning awards, recognition, and a six-figure salary. But then she attended a silent retreat, one that promised nothing except presence. In the stillness of the retreat, without a phone or agenda or anyone needing her, she broke down on the third day, not from pain, but from confusion. She said, "I realized I didn't know who I was without all the roles I played, and I didn't want to go back to being her." What she experienced was a cracking open of her spiritual core. And upon returning home, she found that she could no longer move through life the way she used to. Her goals didn't excite her. Her job felt soulless. Even her relationship felt strained. But again, that didn't mean she had failed. It meant she had awakened. This transition, however, isn't just psychological. It is also less biological. After a spiritual awakening, the body must rewire itself. The nervous system, which had been operating in survival mode, fueled by cortisol, adrenaline, and external stimulation, suddenly finds itself without the usual stressors to respond to. But here's the thing, it doesn't relax immediately. Instead, it often shuts down temporarily. This is why so many women feel fatigued, numb, or disconnected from their usual sense of purpose. It's not that they don't want to do things. It's that their system is asking for stillness, for recalibration. In neuroscience, this is often described through the lens of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to new beliefs and experiences. When you awaken spiritually, your thoughts begin to shift from fear-based patterns to presence-based awareness. But your brain and body, having spent years conditioned by stress and survival, need time to catch up. You're not unmotivated. You're rewiring. It's like trying to write a new story, but your hand is still shaking from the trauma of the old one. Give it time. Let the hand steady itself. Let the nervous system trust the new direction. Let the old motivations die, so the new ones, rooted in purpose and presence, can rise. There's a deep intelligence within the body that knows how to heal, how to align, how to awaken. But most women have spent so long overriding this wisdom by pushing, performing, pleasing, that when the body finally speaks with clarity, it feels foreign. A woman's spiritual awakening, when honored properly, is not a crisis. It is an invitation. But the invitation is not to do more. It is to feel more, to become more internally honest, to let go of the person she pretended to be for the world, and to come home to who she actually is when no one's watching. This kind of self-honesty demands courage, because it doesn't just reveal the beauty of who you are. It also reveals the pain you've been avoiding, the heartbreaks you ignored, the truths you silenced to keep a relationship going, the parts of yourself you abandoned to be accepted. When you wake up spiritually, the cost of betraying yourself becomes too high to continue. And so, you stop chasing things that were never yours. You stop forcing what no longer fits. You stop pretending to enjoy what drains you. This is the sacred pause between the old life and the real one. Yet, in a society that rewards constant movement, this pause feels threatening. Others may not understand it. Some will judge it. They may say, "You've changed," or "You're being lazy," or "You're distant lately." But what they don't see is that you're not retreating from life. You're returning to it on new terms. When a woman begins to listen to her own rhythms, rather than the noise of the world, her entire nervous system starts to regulate. Her breath becomes slower. Her decisions become clearer. Her boundaries become stronger. And her relationships begin to change. Not through control or conflict, but through presence. And this is where true connection is born. Because when you stop showing up from a place of fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of being alone, you begin to love from wholeness, not hunger. This shift is not loud, it is not dramatic, but it is powerful. It's the kind of inner power that doesn't need to prove anything. It just is. A woman who has lost her motivation after awakening has not lost her way. She is clearing the space to find a new one. This is the moment to stop asking, how do I get back to who I used to be? And start asking, who am I becoming now that I've stopped pretending? A real story comes to mind. A woman in her early 50s who had spent her whole life being a caretaker. Her children were grown, her marriage was quiet, and her career, while stable, had always felt like a compromise. One morning, after years of emotional numbness, she woke up with a strange sense of detachment. The things that once gave her purpose, managing a household, planning family events, volunteering, no longer stirred her spirit. She confided in a friend saying, "I feel like my life is empty." But the friend, a quiet soul, replied, "Maybe your life isn't empty. Maybe it's finally quiet enough for you to hear your own voice." That sentence struck her like lightning. Over the next year, she didn't rush to find her motivation. Instead, she began to slow down. She started journaling, walking, reading philosophy and poetry, sometimes crying for no reason, other times laughing, even when alone. Her motivation didn't come back in the form of goals. It came back in the form of truth, of simplicity, of choosing peace over pressure. This is the new energy that follows spiritual awakening. Not the motivation to perform, but the motivation to live authentically, to be deeply rooted in who you are, to create, speak, serve, and love from a place that isn't reactive, but intentional. And yet, for this transformation to complete itself, we must understand the physiological truth. The nervous system is the bridge between your spiritual awakening and your physical reality. If your nervous system is in constant fight or flight, you will not hear the voice of your soul clearly. You will hear urgency, panic, doubt. But when the nervous system begins to calm through breath, stillness, meditation, and nature, the soul can finally speak without interruption. And what it often says is not "go faster," but "be here." This is where real motivation is born, not from fear, not from guilt, not from comparison, but from truth, quiet, presence. And that is where we continue. After a woman experiences spiritual awakening, something within her shifts permanently. She no longer moves from the same fuel source as before. The fire that once pushed her to outperform, to prove her worth, or to constantly win others' approval begins to burn out, and in its place, a new flame tries to rise. But it does not burn with urgency. It burns with truth. It flickers with depth. And most of all, it refuses to be manipulated. This is the moment when old forms of motivation begin to crumble, particularly the ones rooted in external validation. The smile she wore so others would feel comfortable, even when she herself was not okay. The extra tasks she accepted so no one would think she was lazy. The way she shrank her truth in a relationship just to keep the peace. These patterns no longer sit well in her spirit, not because she suddenly became defiant, but because her awareness no longer allows self-betrayal to feel normal. And when the awakening strips her of these masks, she is left standing in the rawness of who she truly is. The chase is over. But now she must ask herself, what am I moving toward if I no longer need applause to feel alive? This question is difficult for many women because we are often taught that our value comes from being chosen, being liked, being pleasing. From childhood to adulthood, subtle messages train us to attach our sense of worth to how others respond to us. A kind word, a partner's approval, a friend's praise. These become our emotional currency. So when awakening exposes this pattern and begins to dissolve it, it's not just an intellectual realization. It feels like a death. Suddenly, you are no longer chasing compliments. You are no longer interested in fitting in. You are no longer willing to be exhausted just to feel loved. But without that familiar chase, you feel like you're standing in a field of fog. You no longer know where to go. And the motivation that once came so easily, especially when you were trying to be good enough, is no longer there. This is where the shift must happen. The motivation that now calls you is not loud. It will not shout over your fear. It whispers through meaning. It is rooted not in what others think of you, but in what you deeply value when you are alone with yourself. And this transition takes emotional discipline, because it is far easier to return to the comfort of being liked than to stand in the silence of being true. A woman once described this shift after leaving a long-term relationship. Her entire identity had been wrapped in being the supportive wife. She organized his world, nurtured his moods, and gave endlessly without asking for much in return. But deep down, she was empty. Not because he didn't love her in his own way, but because she had stopped loving herself through the process. When she finally walked away, she thought she would feel empowered. But what came next surprised her. Weeks of total apathy. She didn't want to rebuild. She didn't want to date. She didn't even want to go out with friends. She thought something was wrong with her. But in truth, she was no longer willing to be motivated by the illusion that she had to earn her worth. She was learning to live without needing to be needed. That kind of transition isn't exciting. It's quiet. Sometimes lonely, but it's the only path to authenticity. It's the bridge between the woman she used to be, driven by pleasing others, and the woman she's becoming, led by her own deep truth. This is what makes the post-awakening phase so delicate, because without the pull of outside rewards, many women feel emotionally flat. They wonder why they're no longer passionate about their goals, their careers, or their relationships. They confuse this flattening with depression. But what's actually happening is that the soul is demanding a new type of nourishment, meaning, purpose, integrity. This process is also explained in psychological research through the concept of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. When your motivation is extrinsic, you act in ways that are rewarded by others, status, recognition, approval. But when your motivation is intrinsic, it comes from within. You do things because they align with your inner values, your curiosity, your personal growth. After awakening, many women begin the painful but necessary shift from extrinsic to intrinsic. And just like a detox, the body and mind often feel worse before they feel better. You will likely notice this change in how you relate to relationships. You may find yourself less tolerant of shallow conversations. You may crave silence more than stimulation. You may walk away from dynamics where you're expected to play a role instead of be yourself. And in doing so, you will start to feel your power return. But it will feel foreign at first, because it's no longer attached to being admired. It's grounded in being real. This is the emotional maturity that emerges when a woman learns to live without applause. But what often accompanies this is another experience that confuses even the most grounded among us: emotional stillness. You're not sad. You're not angry. You're just still. And because stillness feels unfamiliar, many women mislabel it as depression. They miss the emotional highs they used to feel from romantic validation, from business, from rescuing others. But what they're missing is not joy. It's adrenaline. The high they once mistook for love was often just stress. The excitement they felt in drama was often just anxiety. After awakening, the nervous system begins to heal. The emotional roller coaster slows down, and in its place comes emotional neutrality, a space where you are no longer constantly reacting. You're observing, you're sensing, you're breathing. But because this emotional space is new, it feels uncomfortable. It feels like something is missing, when in fact, what's missing is the chaos that you used to believe was normal. And here lies one of the most misunderstood parts of spiritual growth. Peace can feel boring at first. The absence of drama can feel dull to a nervous system that's been trained to live in crisis. A calm relationship may feel uninspiring if you associate love with intensity. A quiet evening alone may feel empty if you're used to proving your productivity every hour of the day. But as your body and mind recalibrate, you begin to notice the subtle joys that were once drowned out by noise. A quote by Viktor Frankl speaks directly to this shift. When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. The emotional stillness that comes after awakening is not a problem to fix. It's a space to listen. It's an opportunity to ask yourself, what truly matters to me now? A woman in her 60s once said, "When I was younger, I thought being powerful meant being impressive. Now I realize it means being peaceful." This realization came after years of chasing careers, partners, and recognition, until she burned out. Her awakening wasn't dramatic. It came in small moments, a walk without a destination, a meal eaten slowly, a conversation where she said what she actually meant. And over time, the emotional stillness that once felt like emptiness became her home. It became her power. Stillness is not the absence of emotion. It is the maturity of it. When your joy is no longer dependent on outer conditions, when your peace is not hijacked by other people's moods, when your love flows without attachment. This is emotional wisdom. But it does not arrive overnight. It arrives in the moments when you choose to stay with yourself, even when your emotions are not loud or exciting. It arrives when you no longer need a crisis to feel alive. It arrives when you honor your body's cues rather than override them to meet someone else's expectations. In practical terms, this might look like saying no without explanation, choosing rest over proving your worth, letting someone be disappointed in you without needing to fix their feelings. These are simple acts. But for a woman trained in emotional labor, they are revolutionary, and slowly, the emotional stillness becomes a sanctuary. It becomes the space from which you speak, make decisions, and offer love, not because you're trying to be good, but because you're choosing to be true. This emotional maturity also transforms how you connect. You no longer get swept into other people's chaos. You don't feel responsible for fixing every tension. You start to listen, not to respond or rescue, but to truly understand. And when conflict arises, you don't collapse. You don't over-explain. You meet it with groundedness, with calm, with clarity. This is not coldness. This is sovereignty. A young woman recently shared that after her awakening, her friendships shifted drastically. She no longer felt energized by gossip or comparison. She no longer found comfort in emotionally codependent bonds. And though she feared being alone, she realized that being alone in peace was far better than being surrounded in pretense. Over time, she attracted new relationships, ones where she could breathe. Ones where she was loved not for the mask she wore, but for the truth she lived. This is what emotional stillness invites, a deeper kind of love. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. And yet, it asks something in return. It asks that you stop chasing emotional highs, that you allow yourself to be calm even when others expect you to react, that you honor your inner rhythm even when the world rushes past you. Because the stillness is not the end. It is the doorway into a new way of being. And once you begin to trust it, you realize peace is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of self. And in that presence, something deeper begins to move. A new kind of motivation, one not rooted in validation, urgency, or survival, but in alignment, sincerity, and sacred purpose. For many women, life before awakening was shaped by motion, always doing, always organizing, always serving. There was always something to fix, someone to please, or some ideal to reach. The rhythm was relentless. And though the outer world may have praised her for her strength, her dedication, her ability to handle everything and everyone, deep within, her spirit was whispering for rest. But that whisper was drowned in the noise of daily expectations, obligations, and internalized beliefs that equated worth with constant output. So when a woman undergoes a spiritual awakening, one of the first things to collapse is this compulsion to perform. There is a natural shift from doing to being. It's not laziness, it's not indifference. It's an energetic reorientation, a return to presence. This change is subtle yet radical. Where she once found identity in activity, now she begins to find identity in awareness. Where she once rushed through the morning to cross everything off her to-do list, now she slows down and watches how the sun touches her face through the window. Where she once moved through life with urgency, now she pauses and breathes before she speaks, before she reacts, before she gives her energy away. This new way of being is gentle, but it is not weak. It is soft, but not passive. It is rooted in the ancient understanding that to live meaningfully is not to conquer more. It is to connect more. With breath, with presence, with the life unfolding in each moment. Yet in a society obsessed with productivity, this transition is often misunderstood. She may even feel guilty for not doing enough. Old voices in her mind may say, "You're falling behind," or "You need to keep up," or "You're wasting time." But none of those voices come from truth. They come from conditioning. And when she awakens, she sees this conditioning for what it truly is, a survival response. Because for much of her life, she was not taught to simply be. She was taught to prove, to hustle, to sacrifice, so much so that many women have internalized the belief that rest must be earned, that stillness is dangerous, that if you're not striving, you're failing. But after awakening, these beliefs unravel. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. A woman shared that after years of being a high achiever, working long hours, climbing the corporate ladder, managing a household, she began to lose interest in everything. What once drove her now felt empty. She would sit at her desk and stare at the screen, unable to find the energy to care. She feared she was burning out, but in truth, she was shedding the identity of the over-functioner. What was really happening was an energetic pivot. Her soul no longer wanted to move through life as a machine. It wanted to move as a conscious being. She didn't want to do for the sake of doing. She wanted to move with intention, to live with clarity, to offer her energy in ways that didn't drain her essence. This energy shift is not a decline. It is a return to alignment. The ancient traditions understood this well. In Taoist philosophy, there's a concept known as Wu Wei, the art of effortless action. It does not mean doing nothing. It means doing without force, moving without resistance, acting in harmony with the natural flow of life. When a woman enters this state, she doesn't lose motivation. She regains wisdom. She no longer chases everything. She becomes deeply selective. She says yes with her whole heart and no without guilt. She honors cycles. She listens to her body. She recognizes when her spirit is tired and no longer shames herself for needing rest. This level of self-trust changes everything. It changes how she shows up in relationships, in her work, in her self-talk. She no longer proves herself through exhaustion. She doesn't need to convince anyone of her worth. Her energy becomes sacred, and only those who treat it with reverence are allowed access. One of the most powerful changes that happens during this shift is the way she begins to experience time. No longer racing against it, no longer fearing it. She begins to live as with it. She takes her time walking. She actually tastes her food. She listens fully when someone speaks. And because she's no longer rushing through life, she starts to feel more alive in it. But this kind of presence can be uncomfortable at first, because in the stillness, all the emotions that were numbed by busyness start to rise. Old wounds, unfelt grief, suppressed truths. It's easier to stay distracted than to feel what's been buried. But she chooses to feel. She chooses to sit in the silence and face herself with compassion. And from this sacred silence, she begins to heal. This healing isn't dramatic. It doesn't always involve tears or therapy or grand declarations. Sometimes healing looks like sitting by a tree without needing to talk. Sometimes it's a long bath without checking the phone. Sometimes it's finally allowing herself to nap in the middle of the day without shame. These are small acts, but they carry a powerful message. My being is enough. This inner stillness also redefines how she connects with others. She no longer enters relationships to fill a void. She enters them from fullness. And in doing so, her love becomes more honest, more grounded, more spacious. She can now hold presence with another without trying to fix or change them. She listens not just to words, but to energy. She notices what isn't being said. Her awareness becomes more subtle, more refined. And because she is no longer overwhelmed by emotional noise, she can tune into what truly matters. This is not detachment, it is discernment. Her energy is no longer scattered across 100 meaningless tasks. It is now focused, intentional. She gives her attention to what nourishes her, to what reflects her truth. And in this space, something powerful begins to awaken. Clarity. Not the kind of clarity that comes from overthinking, the kind that arises from deep alignment. She begins to feel pulled towards certain things. A creative project, a heartfelt conversation, a path that once felt impossible now opens effortlessly. And when she moves toward it, it feels like breathing, not striving. This is the return of authentic motivation. But this motivation doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't push. It invites. And here is where the deepest transformation begins. Not in the awakening itself, but in the integration of that awakening. Integration is the path most often ignored because it's not exciting, it's not flashy. It requires patience, presence, practice. A woman might awaken to a deep truth about herself, that she is worthy, that she is powerful, that she is enough. But if she doesn't integrate that truth into how she lives, speaks, and chooses, then that insight fades into memory rather than becoming a living reality. Integration is how wisdom becomes a way of life. It means applying your awareness to the ordinary, not just in meditation, but in conflict. Not just in solitude, but in conversation. It means noticing how your body feels when you say yes to something that violates your boundaries. It means pausing before reacting to a loved one so you can respond with clarity instead of old wounds. It means choosing presence again and again, even when the world pulls you into distraction. And it means making your awakening as practical. For instance, you may have realized during your awakening that your relationship patterns are built on codependence. Integration is not just recognizing that truth, it's practicing new ways of relating, where you express your needs clearly, where you honor your boundaries, where you let others carry their own emotional weight instead of trying to rescue them. You may have realized that your job no longer aligns with your values. Integration doesn't always mean quitting immediately. It might mean reshaping how you show up at work, bringing more authenticity, creating boundaries, or slowly transitioning toward something more aligned. Integration is not about escape. It's about embodiment. It is about weaving your spiritual insight into your physical life, into the way you parent, the way you rest, the way you eat, the way you love. A woman who integrates becomes grounded, rooted, calm. She is not perfect, but she is real, and her energy begins to radiate something others can feel. A presence that is not performative. A love that doesn't come with conditions. A strength that doesn't need to be loud. This is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you who to be. And as she walks this path of integration, motivation returns. But it looks different than before. It's no longer about reaching the next milestone. It's about deepening into the moment. It's no longer about how much she does. It's about how aligned she is when doing it. And with every choice rooted in this clarity, her life begins to reshape itself. Relationships transform. Daily routines become sacred. Even the most mundane moments carry a sense of reverence, because now she is not just awake, she is present. She is not just aware, she is embodied. And in this state, the woman who once thought she lost her motivation discovers something much greater. She never lost anything. She was simply shedding everything that wasn't aligned with her truth, so that the real motivation, the kind that comes from within, could finally be felt. And in this new rhythm of life, everything becomes intentional. Everything becomes alive. And what flows next will no longer be driven by the need to be someone else, but by the quiet, steady power of being fully herself. When a woman experiences a spiritual awakening, what may seem like a loss of motivation is, in truth, a sacred transformation. The drive to please, perform, and prove begins to dissolve, making space for a deeper kind of movement, one rooted in presence, not pressure. In this stillness, she learns to listen, to trust, and to realign her life with what is meaningful, not just what is expected. Her nervous system heals, her emotions stabilize, and her energy shifts from survival to intention. This is not the end of her motivation. It is the beginning of her authentic power. She no longer needs to chase her worth. She becomes it, quietly, unshakably, completely.